All right. Well, thank you for having me. Again, I'm Meredith Stamberger and I work for the Savanna Institute. My role is to provide technical assistance to farmers in Iowa and Western Illinois who want to not only do silvopasture, but any other agroforestry practice. And I feel like, Chad, that was a good intro into some of the things I'm going to be talking about, a little bit about funding, adding trees to your pasture. And it's fun to hear about the veggie flower thing because my background is actually production horticulture. So my start was I had a vegetable CSA, and then I actually found out I could make more money growing flowers. Even though everybody eats, I could make more money selling flowers. And so then moved into more flower production before moving into my role here at Savanna Institute. So that was fun to see. And of course, feel free to interrupt me with questions, but we can also do questions at the end, whichever works. So a little bit about the Savanna Institute. We are a nonprofit organization, and we work mostly in the upper Midwest promoting agroforestry. So we have myself and my colleagues that do technical assistance. We also have researchers and plant breeders, and then also people who do bigger outreach. So we have a lot of different branches, but my role is working directly with farmers. And like I said, we work mostly in the upper Midwest. Our kind of home bases are in Champaign, Illinois, and Madison, Wisconsin, and a bit into Spring Green. We have some home farms and demonstration farms. As you can see, we're not super far west into Iowa, but we do service all of Iowa in terms of technical assistance. But most of our field visits will be more towards the east, as you can see. I mean, not field visits, I'm sorry, like field days rather. So a little bit about agroforestry and how it's different from conventional agriculture. So typically we think of agriculture is done in a separate space from conservation, and even a conservation field is maybe a separate space from nature. But the thing about agroforestry is it's actually a very old historical practice of growing food in the same place where you're doing conservation and the same area that's considered nature. And so agroforestry really can combine these three things and show that we don't need to keep these separate, but conservation can be happening in the same places where we're raising animals and growing food. And this just shows some of the reasons of why we have agroforestry. You know, maybe this would be a dream landscape in some locations where we have so many ecosystem benefits of the increased biodiversity, increased soil capacity by adding organic matter. We're catching fertilizer, we're catching pesticides for higher quality water, diversifying our farm income and things that are coming off the farm. So this is like the ideal. Lots of reasons why people do agroforestry. It's not always income. Sometimes it's wildlife habitat. Sometimes it's beauty. Sometimes it's folks just want to leave a good legacy. And so the USDA defines agroforestry as these 5 distinct practices: forest farming, silvopasture, alley cropping, forest buffers, and windbreaks. And these can sometimes run into each other. They're not always cut and dry. But like I mentioned, we're going to focus on silvopasture today. And silvopasture is the intentional integration of trees, forages, and livestock all together in one system. And this is a very easy reason to talk about why we do silvopasture. So we've all probably seen this before on a hot summer day. The animals, want the shade. Because cattle start feeling heat stress at only 68 degrees. And of course, this is not the greatest scenario because we trample the forage here. We can get a buildup of manure and nutrients. And heat stress is also a financial loss. So these amounts are annual losses in the US as a result of heat stress. So why do we add trees? We add trees for shade and animal comfort. Another reason is when those animals are comfortable, their daily weight gain increases. And so some folks will add artificial shade to get this weight gain, but it's shown that tree shade actually leads to a much greater increase of weight gain compared to artificial shade. Another reason you might want to add trees to your pastures is because forage quality can be higher right underneath those trees, specifically during drought time. So when it's really hot and dry in the summer, those cool season grasses will be more high quality underneath those trees because those trees have a microclimate effect where they're keeping the temperature lower, they're reducing evaporation and evapotranspiration. So it kind of gives you some drought resilience to have these trees. And then another thing that leads to drought resilience is some of these tree species have leaves that are actually high quality and can have high protein content for animals. So you can cut off tree branches if you're in a pinch in a drought time for supplemental feeding for your animals. So when we have more shade, we have less stress and better weight gain. We have drought resilience with higher quality forage under the trees. We also have soil improvements to soil conditions, improved biodiversity because we have more plant species, more insect species, more microorganisms in the soil. Trees can also be used to reduce wind speeds and slow erosion as well. And so here I'm probably just preaching to the choir, but we know that diversity of perennial roots will do more to hold the soil in place and capture nutrients, therefore leading to higher quality water. And also one reason to move towards perennial systems is to reduce our nutrient and pesticide inputs. So there's two different types of silvopasture that we talk about. We have silvopasture by subtraction and silvopasture by addition. And so silvopasture by subtraction is when you are carefully thinning an existing stand of trees, managing so that you can get some sunlight into the bottom so that you can have a forage layer. This is done in like low quality woodlands, maybe shrubby woodlands, and also done in old pine plantations. So one thing that this is not just letting your animals loose in the woods, because that would not be intentional and that would not be managing for a forest or a forage layer. And this is also not done in high quality woodlands. This is what gives a bad rep for animals in the woods when it's not intentional. The other way silvopasture by subtraction is generally not fundable in Iowa with the programs we work with. And it's just not as common with less wooded areas. So this is done more often Minnesota, Wisconsin, and out east. Then the other way we look at silvopasture is silvopasture by addition. So this is where you're planting trees into an existing pasture, maybe into a crop field with the goal that it will eventually be pasture. And this is much more commonly done in both Iowa and Illinois where I work. And so this is going to be our focus, is silvopasture by addition. And then another way to think about silvopasture is, are you planting trees to support your animals, or are you adding animals to support your tree system? So this is kind of, are you focused on the trees or is your focus the animals? And I'll give some examples. So these pictures are from a grass-fed dairy. And so this is where the trees are supporting the livestock system. So this farmer wanted shade for his cows. So the shade is supporting the animals. You can also grow trees, like I mentioned, as a fodder food source for the animals. So these are some examples of species that folks will plant to silvopasture. Willows, as we know, clean toxins out of water, but can also be used as an animal feed source. Willows are high in tannins and are known to reduce parasitic loads in sheep. And sometimes animals will seek out eating willows for medicinal purposes. Honey locusts are also planted out for animals. There are varieties that produce more of these pods, which have a lot of sugar in them, hence the name honey locust. And they have varieties of these pods that are extra sugary. And so this can be a supplemental feed source for cattle. Mulberries are used in silvopasture because leaves can have 15 to 25% protein. So this can be a protein source similar to alfalfa as a backup. Hybrid poplar can be a quick growing food source for animals. So this is another example where your trees are supporting your livestock operation. Some other products you can get are fence posts and timber. If you're planting trees for shade, maybe you can harvest some later for those purposes. Okay, these pictures are demonstrating how your trees can be a fodder food source for your animals in a drought time. So here in this bottom right picture, you can see all the branches have been cut off. This is called pollarding. So trees are pollarded when they're cut higher up in the canopy. So this tree could be cut above browse height, and then all the branches can be fed to the animals, as you can see here, maybe when it's droughty, if you don't have much forage on your pasture. You could also do something called coppicing, and coppice just means you're cutting it off at the base. And so if you were to coppice, you could cut it off at the base and then just let the animals feed straight off of the plant when the shoots come up from the bottom. It just depends on your management. And so this could be called a fodder block, where the trees are providing shade, they have those microclimate benefits. But then if you need some supplemental feed, you can cut them off at browse height, feed them to your animals, and it's a supplemental food source. And then another example of how trees or shrubs specifically can support your animal operation. This is an example of what they call tree range chickens. So the chickens range underneath trees and shrubs. Here, these are mostly hazelnuts. And the idea is that chicken are a jungle fowl. That's where they're from, the jungle. So they like to scratch underneath a canopy layer. So these trees and shrubs provide somewhere for them to be cool, somewhere for them to scratch, and then protection from overhead predators. Another way that trees can support your livestock operation is planting a windbreak, or a shelter belt is what we call it. And of course, we know in the winter we have a lot of northwest winds. And so a shelter belt or windbreak can protect those animals from the blowing wind and the drifting snow. On the other hand, you might have an operation that's focused mostly on your trees, and animals could support the management of those trees.
You'll take that long?
Was that a question? So here's an example of where geese are grazing in an apple cider orchard. And so the geese come in and they help eat pests. So the insects that could be pests for the plants, the apples, and they also eat grass, and they can clean up dropped fruit. So here the focus are the cider apples, and the animals are brought in to support the cider apple production. Another example is having sheep grazing in an orchard. So again, the focus is probably on these fruit trees, and the sheep are just supporting your fruit tree operation. Another reason you might want to add livestock to a tree planting. So an example would be a chestnut orchard. A lot of folks are interested in chestnuts now, but when you plant them, they're usually at a 20 by 20 spacing, and it can take over 10 years for them to really be producing a crop to make you money. So in the meantime, you can be using that land to graze animals, and your animals would really be your source of cash flow until you're profiting from those trees. Okay, and so how are we going to do silvopasture? The design completely depends on what we just mentioned. So are you adding animals into a tree operation, or are you adding trees into an existing livestock operation? And so this picture is from one of our home farms in Spring Green, Wisconsin. And you can see we have this 40-foot spacing, which is usually the minimum width between rows that we design if you are grazing with cattle. Another thing we have to consider are the species to be used. So I mentioned some tree species that are planted for the purpose of tree fodder or supplemental food, but you might also want some trees that you could eventually get a timber harvest from. And so a lot of those trees would be fairly slow growing. So it's good to stagger both fast growing and slow growing trees. So you can add species like poplar and birch that will grow really quickly, provide some immediate shade, while also having species like oak and chestnut and walnut, which will provide wildlife habitat, maybe some nuts for your family, and maybe timber down the road. And so we have the quick growing species that establish right away. Then later those can either be removed or they can be coppiced or pollarded, like we talked about, or they can be cut off at the base or cut off at browse height to encourage that flush of growth that would provide a supplemental food source. And of course, we also have to think about tree protection, because if you plant a new tree in a pasture, it probably won't hold up to the animals out there. So the way a lot of this is done is with electric fence. And so here's one example where you can put electric fence on both sides with the trees in the middle. But as this picture shows, we can already see this is going to require extra management of weed control in this row. And you could easily lose your trees in this row if you can't keep up with weed eating or if you don't have mulch. So that could be an issue. Another way you can protect your trees are with these cages. So there's 3 posts and the wire mesh or cattle panel around it. This is expensive and time consuming, and they might not even hold up to animals rubbing on them. So one novel method that is becoming much more common in silvopasture is doing this tree protection where we have tree tubes. So these are usually 6 foot tall plastic vented tree tubes, running a poly wire along the top at about 6 foot high, and then tying on a 6 foot segment of poly wire that wraps around this tree tube. So what we're doing is we're electrifying the entire tree tube so that the animals do not rub on them. And I'll have some more pictures for this. So here's a close-up of the top. So we have our wire that's running at about 6 foot tall, 6 foot high. There's another poly wire tied on with, you can either use a zip tie or there's insulated twist ties that come with these tubes. And then the wire runs down the tube and wraps around so that the whole tube is electrified. So here's just a little graphic that shows a bit better. So if your high poly wire, your whole tube is electrified and the animals learn very quickly not to rub on them. So here's what it looks like in the field. They're up 6 foot high so that the animals can go through, and the animals learn to duck under. And one of the benefits of them being able to go through is then you can have closer spaced rows. You don't have to worry so much about the 40-foot width. And it's also beneficial because then the animals do the weed control for you. They'll eat right up to the base of that tree tube. And one thing folks are doing, you can get extenders so that your equipment can run underneath. But you might be thinking how 6 foot might not be the best height for a farmer who's walking through their pasture. So some folks are putting extenders on all of these fiberglass stakes, so that's easier to walk through their pasture. They don't have to worry about getting clotheslined by poly wire. So if you don't want to deal with all the tree protection, there's another, here, this shows another method of establishing a silvopasture. And so this goes to one of our other agroforestry practices called alley cropping. So how alley cropping is done is we're planting rows of trees, and in the middle or the alley, we're still growing a crop such as your classic corn and soybeans. So we would plant the trees, we're still growing corn and soybeans until the trees get a little bit larger. And then folks will often transition to a small grain, such as wheat, which is growing in the fall, sometimes after trees drop their leaves, and then growing again in early spring before the trees really leaf out. Then once the trees get even taller, you can transition to hay, and then eventually, or straight to pasture. And so the benefit of this system is you're still getting the cash flow of the grain in the alleys. And then by the time it's a pasture, your trees are already big enough that you don't have to worry about tree tubes and you don't have to worry about poly wire and protecting them from the animals. And so this picture just shows of a new alley cropping demonstration farm that we have in Illinois. This one will not be turned into pasture. As you can see, it is prime farm ground. But this just shows an example of alley cropping in real life. One thing that's really important with alley cropping is making sure that these alley widths will match your machine width, because you don't want to get to the end of an alley and have a 5 feet row that you have to run your combine all the way down just to get a little piece left. So it's a lot of money to put trees out on the land. So we are always working with funding programs to um, see how we can get assistance for these. So we work a lot with NRCS, and Chad introduced that already. EQIP, where they have a flat rate reimbursement per tree. There's also CSP with those 5-year annual payments. Another option, which isn't done as often, is with CRP. And of course, the benefit with CRP is you have the 10-year rental payment while those trees are establishing. You won't be able to graze during that contract period. You won't be able to harvest from your trees, but you can use those 10 years to establish your trees. And then instead of re-enrolling, you just end your contract after the 10 years, establish your forage layer, and then your trees are probably big enough that you don't need to protect them. So that's another option. We've also been working a lot with a program called the Expanding Agroforestry Project, which is managed by the Nature Conservancy. It's really enticing because they have a high payment rate per tree, much higher than what you get through the NRCS. But the benefit of the NRCS is that it'll always be there. The Nature Conservancy is a 5-year program. But one of the issues, of course, that we're having right now is this program is kind of on pause right now with the federal funding freezes. And then besides USDA programs, sometimes county conservation offices will have their own programs that can fund trees. And there are also some other private grants that we can help you access for agroforestry. So it's not always USDA programs that we're using. So if you're interested in adding trees to your farm, not just your pasture, but any agroforestry system, we do have a technical assistance program. This is free since we are mostly grant funded, and we provide assistance in the upper Midwest. Like I mentioned, so Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan. And we go through this process, which is very similar to a process as if you're working with NRCS. The first step, which is different, is you apply online. So if you just search Savanna Institute Technical Service, there's an online application. And then the first thing we do is we have a virtual meeting where we talk about your goals. What type of agroforestry do you want to do? How do you envision your land in the future? We'll set up a field visit and ideally get NRCS or your local soil and water conservation folks out with us as well. And then we'll work on a design and a draft plan. And so we will help you choose species and spacing and layout. We'll make a map so that you have the number of each plant. And the goal is that we would have a map to present to a funding program like EQIP or CSP or the Expanding Agroforestry Grant. So we would also help you navigate funding programs if you need help with that too. If you don't want to go through our program and you're just interested, what tree crops could I grow on my land? I want to grow some more fruit trees, or I want to put some trees out in my pasture. You can use this tool called Canopy Compass. And the thing that we use it mostly for, these crop suitability maps. So it takes into account information about your soil and climatic information, and then shows you which perennial crops could work on your land. And so Canopy Compass includes many species. They're still doing research to add more, and they're also taking suggestions. If there's something you really want to see, there's a suggestion box. You can send them a message and let them know. But how it works, so when you go to Canopy Compass, you'll have this big map. And here's crop suitability layers you can toggle on and off. So this one's showing suitability for blackcurrant, but there's also species that are commonly used for silvopasture. And of course, you can see it on this large scale, but you can zoom in to your farm as well. And you can generate this report, which has soil information and crop suitability, which we'll talk about here. So for example, if this is your field and you mapped it out, drew the borders, you generated this Canopy Compass report, then it shows you, okay, chestnuts, a lot of people are interested in. It looks like most of the site would work for chestnuts. One thing that's great about this breakdown, so we see this one area is unsuitable. So you can look here in the breakdown, why would this area be unsuitable? We can see it's due to soil pH. So this is likely because the pH is too high. Chestnuts don't really like soil pH over 6.5. So we can see what are the limiting factors here. We can also see maybe there's some poor soil drainage. Chestnuts don't like wet feet. The reports, we'll do the crop suitability reports. We'll do these crop suitability pages for all of the crops. Here's another example of persimmons. We can see most of this land would work, but for some reason this area is drawn out. If we want to know why, we just look at the breakdown over here, which will come out on your report. It looks like soil drainage, so it's probably poor drainage. Water table depth, so there's also probably a high water table here. And this is also just a starting point. So this is based on research and a lot of publicly available soil data, but of course, you know your farm well. So you might need to ground truth some of this, or maybe you'll know, oh, I adjusted the pH here, so maybe it's not an issue, or I have some tile drainage, so maybe I could still grow shrubs there. But this is just a good starting point to see what is possible on my land. Besides that, to learn more, we have a YouTube channel. If you go to Savanna Institute, there's this little search bar. You can just type in Silvopasture, and there's lots of videos that come up. Besides the Savanna Institute, there's so many good resources. There's these great books, Silvopasture, The Grazier's Guide to Trees. The Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri has a lot of good resources, so definitely check those out. And that's all I have. We can do questions now, and also feel free to email me anytime with questions you might have. Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
Yeah, Meredith, I have a situation on a farm that I manage. It's about 20 acres of what I would call gallery forest, native gallery forest. A lot of the trees in there are well over 100 years old. And I guess you would say that Mother Nature has been converting it to silvopasture by subtraction. There were a lot of ash trees, native ash trees there, and other hardwoods. It was not ever managed, and it was primarily shade for cattle, as they did get some pasture benefit from it, but actually better pastures on both sides of it and water sources on one side. And the storms, high winds that we've had in the last 4 or 5 years have taken out a lot of the older hardwoods, walnuts and oaks. And so, like I said, Mother Nature's been thinning it, and this is on really steep ground coming off of a creek bottom. What I guess my question really is, if you were going to start managing in that now, where would you start? Because you do have some existing old mature trees. Definitely the canopy has been opened up, so there's sunlight getting to the ground now. Would it be better to clean up and get rid of any of the damaged trees that are there and try to seed more for pasture benefit? That's kind of where I'm leaning right now, but that's
not, that's pretty close to what my recommendation would be. Yeah, cleaning up fallen trees. A lot of times those areas would be where a lot of invasives come in. Do you have a lot of shrubby invasives in the understory?
There's a little bit of a problem with multifloral rose. I've been able to manage that. That's probably the main one. I don't know if I need to see the state forester but so many of the large mature trees have a lot of limb damage, and those older trees, because they were never managed, don't have, even though they're hardwoods like walnut and oak. They don't really have much timber value because they weren't managed for that.
Sure. Mhm. Yeah, I would say definitely also, like you mentioned, seeding, establishing a good forage seeding on the ground would be a good place to start for right now because you want to make sure there's really good soil cover because those timber soils can be a lot more prone to erosion. So you want to make sure that your forage is very well established before moving animals into it.
Okay.
Yeah, and feel free to send me an email too. Also, one thing to note is the NRCS State Forester, Bailey, is very enthusiastic about agroforestry. Sometimes foresters are understandably nervous about silvopasture because of so much damage that has been done to high quality woods with animals. Um, so sometimes we get some pushback from the foresters, which is very helpful. But the NRCS State Forester is very on board with agroforestry. So Bailey, she's a great resource as well.
Okay. And old pallets, 3 old pallets make a pretty good protection for for your trees that you don't
Oh,
want.
sure.
It's ugly, but kind of goes against
Yeah.
that beauty part, but it keeps the cows off the trees.
Yeah, that's great. Anything that works for your system is great. I love to hear novel methods. So